Growing up Catholic, I've always been pro-life. Never really knowing my own reason why, I just knew that it was the right thing. Following in my parents' footsteps, I prayed for the unborn, never really knowing why. I was praying because my parents were, and if your parents do something, it must be the right thing to do. If you've ever been driving south on 69 and have seen the cornfield with the crosses, this field belongs to my dad. They call this a cemetery of innocence. This is a representation of all the lives that are lost due to abortion. There's no possible way to put out a cross for every life, but the crosses that are there represent a total of 4,300 abortions a day just in the United States. When I was little, I remember going to this field to clean, fix, and replace the crosses. When doing so, it never really crossed my mind as to what the crosses were for. Now my heart just aches for those children. It wasn't until my freshman year of high school that I finally took my first steps towards the pro-life movement. I was sitting in my pew at church, listening to announcements when they brought up the pilgrimage for life. Not really knowing what it was or what it entailed, I looked over and whispered to my dad, "We should go." He was very hesitant when I first asked because who would want to go to Washington, D.C. the end of January to walk up a hill in the freezing cold? Then my dad finally came to the realization that he would be a fool not to spend 4.5 days with his little baby girl. Every year, the Diocese of Evansville takes 3 to 5 buses up to Washington, D.C. for the March for Life. We also take part in other activities, but the whole pilgrimage is centered around the march. The theme every year is C2ND, from conception to natural death. They call this trip a pilgrimage because we are making a sacrifice and also journeying somewhere far to serve a better purpose. In this case, traveling to Washington, D.C. to fight for the dignity of life. I can honestly tell you that going on this trip was one of the best decisions that I have ever made. It wasn't until the actual day of the march that I had my eye-opening moment. Vice President Mike Pence was speaking, and I remember walking with my dad, being amazed at how many people were there to support one cause. We were standing shoulder to shoulder with the people around us, and this just blew my mind. Until that moment, I just thought Catholics were the ones who were pro-life. When the march finally began, the crowd seemed to get bigger and bigger. At the final stretch of the march, we rounded the corner to walk up Capitol Hill. This is when it happened. There I saw multiple screens set up to show what the aborted baby's body looked like after its life had been terminated. This was my eye-opening moment. Then and there, I finally knew that under my own beliefs, that I was pro-life. There are no words to describe it, but I could just feel it. My parents' belief finally became my own. The genocide that we are seeing in our country is so heartbreaking that I just knew that this is something in our world that needs to be stopped. That's why I've attended the march every year since that moment. There's nothing more powerful than to meet a woman who said she was going to abort her baby, but then changed her mind at the last minute, and to see her marching next to that child just a few years later. A year later, after attending the march for a second time, it was announced that New York and Virginia would be legalizing full-term abortions. This was very upsetting to hear, especially just a few days after the march. How could anyone kill their own child, and how could a licensed professional assist in such an act? It's hard for me personally to understand why some people don't believe that a child in the womb is a real baby. Last year's theme for the 2019 March for Life was unique from day one: pro-life is pro-science. If more people would do the research, they would know that science backs up the pro-life movement. They would know that the small clump of cells inside a woman is a real child. I saw something on Instagram one day that read, "One cell on Mars would be considered life," and this statement just blew my mind because it is so true. If there was an astronaut to go to Mars and find this tiniest little cell, they'd be able to make the statement that there's life on Mars. And yet, we can take an ultrasound of a fully formed baby with a beating heart, and there are still people who deny that this child is alive. Mother Teresa once said, "Any country that accepts abortion is not teaching its people to love, but to use violence to get what they want. That is why the greatest destroyer of love and peace is abortion." It is so sad to see that women can so easily sacrifice their own children on an altar of convenience. But there are some mothers who don't realize that they have other options. The child doesn't get to choose the reason they are coming into this life, so why should we get to choose that that child gets to live? When I, as a Catholic, say that I'm praying for the unborn, that also means that I'm praying for the mothers who felt like there were no other options. I also pray for the women who don't see the mass slaughter that is happening in our country. We have a generation of powerful women telling other women that it is okay to kill their unborn child so it's not a burden on them. Life begins at conception and ends at natural death, and we as humans have no right to decide when that life should end. Every life is precious because God created us in His perfect image. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. We as humans make mistakes, but God makes no mistakes. He created every single one of us with human dignity, and when we take away a child's life, we take away that dignity. The most fundamental right in this world is the right to life. My plan is to continue fighting for the unborn, the ones who don't have a voice, and hope that one day I'll be able to travel back up to Washington, D.C. with my dad to celebrate the end to abortion.